Okay, right, let's get on with the show here. We have a few slides to get through today. Probably our lecture this week and next week won't exactly keep track with the reading. That's because the I there's enough material, honestly, uh, in the just sort of lead up to 2008 to push it all into one lecture. I don't think is a good idea, and so I'm probably going to save some of the stuff from about the fall of the Berlin Wall onwards to next week's lecture. But and that's fair, I think, given that almost like so much of the rest of the class is going to be talking about the financial crisis. So from 2008 onwards, definitely doesn't need a whole um, sort of lecture on it, because we're going to have so many lectures on it. You guys will, in terms of your reading, be kind of a little bit ahead of me next week. That's fine. I just want to make sure in the lectures that I do justice to the history of the EU prior to 2008. I'm going to go into some details that the book doesn't go into, and there's some reasons for that, because I'm interested in theory, and I'm interested in theories that try to explain the EU, that explain European Union integration. I mean, there's different ways of understanding its significance, and different ways of understanding what the driving forces are, the motivations, the dynamics behind the EU. So I want to be respectful of that, and I love, of course, I love your textbook. I think it's a good textbook, but I just have sort of slightly different interests as I approach this topic. So I have some knowledge I can share with you that isn't necessarily covered in the textbook we're going to be using. As we go through the semester, I'll be bringing in some other stuff as well, and we'll hopefully have a kind of an organic class. The syllabus is a contract, obviously, but as I note in the syllabus, we may need to have a flexible attitude, because obviously real world current affairs events might intrude on what we're doing. I'm also very conscious that the syllabus doesn't talk about certain things like the Syrian refugee crisis, which isn't strictly a topic to do with the EU in some ways, and in other ways it absolutely is, because it reveals flaws in the way the EU is set up, that the refugee crisis has taken place. And so as we go through the semester, I will maybe find ways to introduce current affairs issues that I think are germane into the readings. Of course, these are recent events, so the textbooks, in some ways, the academic analyses haven't, in a sense, been published yet. And we can find magazine articles, and we can find newspaper articles and things that are podcasts. I'm a huge fan of podcasts. I'll be sharing some stuff with you guys about that. Some of it I'll just share on Slack, because it's not like required material, right? It's just for interest. But if it's required, I'll paste it or I'll post it on Blackboard. Okay, so I'll break this lecture up into two bits, because I often have trouble if I record anything longer than 40 minutes for YouTube. Just seems sometimes they don't properly upload. So I'll break this into two chunks, and we'll see how far we get today. And whatever I don't cover today, we'll pick up next week. And by the end of next week's lecture, I should be neck and neck with you guys. So basically, we want to do in the first half, for the first 40 minutes is try to get as far as the European defense controversy. And this first half of the lecture is really about kind of trying to map out the early ideas behind European integration, which is to say the development of the European Union, or what we know today as the European Union. But we say integration because we're talking about political integration, right? Obviously there's a lot of countries in Europe, and this process of integration has been putting them under one flag, one sort of if you wanted to sort of borrow the metaphor of the history of the United States of America. I mean, this is how the United States became one country, right? It's the same idea here. Only, the history of Europe's integration goes back a long time. It certainly, is also a story of sub-national integrations as well. I mean, Germany wasn't always one country. It was, many states within just what we today recognize or understand as Germany. So, there's other integrations to be talked about here, and other histories that we could be reflecting on, and we'll try to talk a little bit about those, I suppose, in the next little bit. And then following that, of course, you have the World War I, World War II, major events that left scars, emotional scars, on the minds of many commentators and analysts, and the average people, ordinary people as well. So that experience shapes the desire for a European Union, and I think there are analysts who would say, who sort of poo-poo the idea that sentiment had much to do with the emergence of the European Union. I would disagree. I'm just an idealist, but I think the European Union definitely can be said to have origins in the way people felt after World War II and the tragedy that befell the continent. And it's with a certain pride, I think, that many people who believe in the European Union today would sort of hold up the history of the European Union as flawed as it is, and say, at least we haven't had a war in, several decades now. That's weird. It's my Siri responding to something I said. Very strange. Anyway, so let's get on with our first proper slide here. And this, of course, is a painting by, I think it's Delacroix, and it's Liberty Leading the People. Famous painting. And that's there for a reason, because, of course, there are different contrasting visions about what European Union might mean, and there's different sort of ways of tracing the historical origins of it. As I was saying in the intro lecture just now, one potential model for European integration prior to the two world wars, going back to the 19th century, would be the Zollverein. And this is when 39 states of the so-called German Confederation at the time came together to create what was called a customs union. And the objective there was to try to remove internal customs barriers and create an external tariff, which is to say that they were going to remove taxes at their borders for goods and services circulating between them, but maintain a common tariff or tax for goods and services entering their union. So this was kind of would be quite remarkable historically, because for many commentators it would be seen as the first ever example of how nation states could integrate economically, but without themselves making any political sacrifice. In other words, without giving up their sovereignty. I'll talk a bit more about sovereignty in a little while, but basically without giving up their political power. But a lot of critics would note that it would be misleading to take the Zollverein as a model for what we know today as the EU, as a viable model at least, because while the mechanisms that they put in place obviously were beneficial in terms of creating efficiency within their economic union, it's important to recognize that the lack of a political supranational body. Now, I've just used the word there, supranational, and this isn't a word that we use to refer to a power that's over the nation states of a group, over a group of nation states, that has the power to order those nation states what to do, right? To invoke a bit of international relations theory here, if you've taken an international relations class, and this is a problem that's going to be kind of reoccurring throughout this lecture and next lecture. This is a problem that the European Union is going to be confronting in its emergence, in its development. Of course, no one at this point in time knows about anything called the European Union. I mean, that's just not even a name that people are using. The vision of it is, if a vision like that does exist, it's not thought of as anything other than science fiction at that time. But if you read international relations theory textbooks, they talk about the problem of anarchy, which is the problem of the lawlessness that exists in the sphere of interaction between nation states, and the fact being that there's no power over those nation states telling them what to do. So therefore, those nation states are free to do what they want, which we might like, but it also means that there's no police force. And so if a big guy starts pushing around a little guy, there's no one to come and tell the big guy to stop being such a bully, to stop taking advantage of the little guy, stealing his lunch, to borrow a schoolyard metaphor. Most of us will remember the schoolyard, and that was a whole other type of anarchy in its own right, but it's a good metaphor for us here. So this is the question that the Zollverein kind of poses, right? Okay, we've got this great idea of doing an economic integration, creating this common tariff at our borders, at our collective borders, but without some sort of mechanism of political cohesion, you're not going to be able to constrain what we might want to call, to borrow another metaphor, a free rider, right? The free rider problem is relevant here. That's when someone, if the government, the city of Columbus, the city of Athens, the city of Chillicothe, whichever campus you might be on where you're taking this class, provides a bus service that's partially paid for out of the fare that you pay the bus driver out of your pocket, but it's also partially paid for out of taxation. And so if you get on the bus without paying your fare, you're basically passing the costs of you using the bus, because you're adding your weight and your luggage's weight onto the bus, and it's consuming more gas. You're passing the costs. You're not paying for that, so you're passing the costs onto the other customers and the taxpayers. So you're a free rider, and that's why we sort of refer to the free rider problem. So the Zollverein had this problem with the free rider kind of metaphor applied. We have free riding states. So because there's no referee power, because there's no sovereign entity or sheriff or police force over the states of the Zollverein, there's no one to enforce it. There's no one to enforce, and so later on, if you know your German history, and I would concede I'm not an expert, but of course you'll know that one state, Prussia, becomes particularly powerful, and then regardless of the feelings of the other participants of the Zollverein, it's able to impose its will and transforms the whole thing into the German Empire in 1871, which is not a very democratic way to create an integration, right? So it's certainly a way of creating integration, but it's not a way of integrating that many of us would like. To be integrated at the pointy end of a bayonet is not cool. So maybe we need another model, right? So a second model then is of course nationalism, and Europe. European historians, European commentators almost always sort of think of nationalism and the European ideal as being antagonistic notions, right? That nationalism is often thought of as sort of as being central to a central cause of World War One. You know, the Great War, and that's fair, but we should do service to the original sort of ideals of nationalism, which were the idea of a secular, democratic state as an alternative, as an emancipatory alternative to monarchy and monarchism. The principles of the French Revolution in 1789 are central here to this understanding of nationalism. So, looking at the French nationalism of that time, we see that was not based on any particular trait or, an idea of French identity, but celebrated rather as the right of man to a secular nation. Similarly, in Italy, the ideology of Italian integration in the 1830s rotated a lot around the idea of a pro-nation that was also a right of all European peoples. So everyone could have a nation, everyone should have a nation, a principle of autonomy, and fulfilling Enlightenment ideals in that sense. The principle of democracy and autonomy are central and go hand in hand in that sense. German unification, I think, for many was similar. Now, obviously, later we're going to see Italians and Germans. We're going to see Italian and German nationalisms expressing themselves in a much darker and more sinister way. And certainly, nationalism has risks to it because it can become fascistic and all the rest. But I think we do want to keep some space reserved for the idea of a democratic, enlightened nationalism. And I think it's that spirit, that sort of footnote in the history of nationalism relating to its origins that perhaps explains today why, if you were following sort of European Union politics over the last year or two, you'll know, and we will be reading Yanis Varoufakis' book soon, that there's a principled way in which the left also can express a nationalism, and that is a nationalism that's sometimes seen as a democratic nationalism, and so it became central to certain left-wing people in Greece, but also in Britain very, very recently, who support the idea of exit or leaving the European Union. Now, most people would say that exit, be it Brexit or Grexit, British exit, Greek exit, would be kind of right-wing ideas. And that's fair enough, given the history of European nationalism being fairly right-wing phenomena. But those notions of left-wing exits or left exit lexits in Greece and Britain are certainly worthy of further analysis. Another model that we have then is the idea of integration through international law. This is kind of a technocratic integration, expressed probably most forcefully with the Anglo-French Treaty of 1860. And one way to think about that is the fact that there was a kind of we use the word globalization to describe some of the phenomena that are going on in our integrating global economy today. Transnational corporate activities, the emergence of sort of distributed types of labor and production, supply chains, that kind of thing, right? We attach globalization to all of that as a term. And I think in the mid-18th century, given that at that time, intra-European trade was booming, there was a sense among some countries that a Europe-wide common market might be possible, perhaps something like the Zollverein, but again, kind of not based. The difference being where the Zollverein was based on a German identity. The Anglo-French Treaty was based not on any national identity at all, but the idea of a kind of a multinational common market, and it raised the question how you were going to overcome that national identity element. So, interestingly, the commentator at the Heinrich Trippel, who I think was a German historian, argued in the 1930s about the Anglo-French Treaty, that it sort of expressed a fundamental puzzle which the European Union today would really have to learn from. And I quote, on the one hand, the nation is not the only living form that is capable of creating law, right? I mean, we shouldn't think that the nation state is the only vehicle that can contain human politics, right? Surely our imaginations can come up with something better, in other words. But on the other hand, he says, the commonality of important vital interests among a plurality of subjects and the consciousness of this commonality must be considered as an essential presupposition of such creation of law. And that's basically saying that you have to have not just the vital interests in your mind among your plurality of subjects as you try to create new law-giving entities, but you have to have a sense of some kind of community, a consciousness of commonality, a way not just of thinking about our self-interests as being connected to this law-giving entity, but also perhaps a sense of who we are, a sense of solidarity, a sense of common purpose. In other words, politics isn't just about the robotic part of ourselves that calculates what we want, what we need, and how to get it right from the, how to get our slice of the cake, but also is about our feeling of belonging, perhaps. So that's the flaw there, I think, with integration through international law, and it's a flaw that's definitely going to haunt the EU. And so then fourth, which I won't say very much about, is just the idea of integration through empire. And there's a lot that can be said about this, but globally speaking, not just in Europe, but throughout the 19th century, we saw a rush of European countries to expand outwards and colonize. Of course, that is a kind of integration in its own right, and it's just worth mentioning that was driven by a lot of racist ideas. There were social Darwinistic ideas about master races and the entitlement of European powers to govern, to rule others who are seen as inferior. Sometimes we can turn to critics, on the left, I think, for good commentary on this stuff. And Lenin wrote a very famous book about imperialism, and asked about whether this kind of power could be a real force for integration, and effectively saw the rush to conquer and colonize and parcel up the whole planet into various empires as being kind of a suicidal race that, once all that space was gone, and there was no other empty space for the powers to expand into, they would try to expand into each other, and effectively they'd end up at war with each other, which history shows I think he was not entirely incorrect, because that takes us right to World War I. This is now moving into sort of World War I, World War II, especially into World War II. I mean, I think the two wars changed people thinking a lot about the urgency of needing to build a European Union. And one of the things that I think come through in the analyses here are, just that, it has to happen. This has to be done. So out of the ideas we've just been discussing, and this question of what do you do about the lack of sovereign power to prevent free riding within any integrated system, in a system of anarchy. You start to have to think about serious alternatives that are going to prevent the repeated cycle of violence between nation states on account of their selfishness. And looking at the aftermath of World War II, many intellectuals like Altiero Spinelli, who's on the left here, that's Spinelli, he had been, like, other intellectuals, Antonio Gramsci, whatever, incarcerated during World War II in Italian prisons. He was an Italian man. A lot of intellectuals were locked up, and in the time in jail, they reflected on the politics of their time, of their world, and when they got out of jail, they set out to try to figure out this problem. What do you do about the state? And they said after World War II, it wasn't enough to beat Germany once again, right? This history is going to keep repeating itself. You'll always have to defeat Germany over and over again, or if not Germany, then someone else, right? Because technology has given us such an amount of military power now, and the temptation with state politics is always to kind of snatch or cheat or free ride, take someone else's lunch. And so there's always this fear of reaction, this fear of using sovereign power to kind of nefarious ends. So the condition of possibility that allows that to continue is the fact that we still carry out our politics in these things called nation states. States are the problem. And as long as we continue to have nation states, we're going to keep regressing into this logic of us versus them, how I can get ahead, how I can, get something I want from this other person. And so cooperation in that sort of purely horizontalist sense is doomed to fail. And given that people like Spinelli had read their Marx, read their Lenin, they were all very capable of or very aware of the promise of the left in trying to the ambition of the left in uniting the downtrodden masses of Europe into something better. Marx had written in the Communist Manifesto famously, and you might know this quote, "Working men of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains." But of course, what had happened tragically in World War I, World War II, was that rather than the proletariat of Europe uniting, they had instead been, they had their passions reattached, distracted to their nation, and as part of their loyalty to their nation, as an expression of their loyalty to their nation, they had gone out on the battlefield and slaughtered each other, which is terribly tragic from a Marxist perspective, right? Because that's just not what the Communist Manifesto was about at all. This is not working men of the world unite. This is working men of Germany and working men of France uniting and then slaughtering each other. It's a very tragic kind of outcome. What they really should have been doing was the French and the Germans and the Italians should have been uniting together to fight the capitalists, who were the people that ran the system that denied them their very humanity. So in that sense, then, there's this kind of idea, a hope and aspiration on the part of people like Spinelli for, and he was not, I don't think Spinelli was a communist, by the way, so please don't hear me as saying that. But certainly he would have been aware of that history, that tragedy, through, I think, maybe a socialist lens, And so for that reason, then he believed it wasn't, we had to fix the problem, we'd have to abolish the nation state. And so at a famous conference in 1948, the Hague Conference, Spinelli, again, who is the figure here to the left, he was the first sort of person to really express a vision of a federalist European Union, and really just wanted to abolish the state altogether, complete total transfer of sovereignty, and just create, out of the ashes of World War II, a European nation state, much like the United States. Now, on the right, of course, is Winston Churchill, the unmistakable face of Winston Churchill. And he advocated something very, very different to what Spinelli argued. And in a speech in 1946, called for a United States of Europe. Now, not to be confused with the United States of America, because the United States of America is one country. What Churchill was proposing was much more something like a union or a confederation. And this would have brought together the states of Europe in something much more like what we sort of would recognize as a United Nations, or a very loose confederation of nation states with a consultative assembly, very little power at the center over the subunits, the substates. And of course, this makes sense because if you think about it, guys, you still have Britain in 1948 thinking of itself as the victor of World War II, or one of the major victors of World War II, still thinking of itself as an imperial power with a great navy. Empirically, those sentiments were problematic because, of course, Britain had lost a lot of power after World War II, and would continue to lose power through the next couple of decades, and would have to relinquish its empire. But right now, people like Winston Churchill really do still sort of believe that that Britain is a power. And so why would a power like that, a victor, want to subject itself to a total transfer of sovereignty, such as what Spinelli was advocating? So yeah, you have two very different notions there. So just about 7 or 8 minutes left in this portion of the class, and then I'll stop, and you guys can take a break, and then you can click the link for part 2. So yeah, we've just been talking about the immediate context after World War II, and debates that were taking place between people like Churchill, people like Spinelli. And the question is, like, how out of these debates do the actual European institutions that we know and recognize today start to take shape? And as one scholar, Desmond Dinan, notes, it's fair to say the European Union is not really a process that emerges out of one theory in whole cloth, like it was handed down from on high by some kind of like founding fathers, and just sort of arrived in one piece. It's actually been a kind of a history driven by circumstance, driven by a lot of luck, and driven by, it's fair to say, individual initiative. And I think, this is all sort of a way of introducing the question of history, both as providing opportunities, but also constraints in terms of what can be done, what can even be thought, what can even be imagined, because we're all creatures of history, and the way we think is a product of our place in time, as well as everything else, right? So the driving forces to create the European Union then are going to be individual politicians, but often those politicians are going to be motivated by national interests, or the institutions that they feel they represent, the interests of those institutions. So we're going to see clashes in this history here between these various positions, and they will be fighting with each other as they assert different ideals of what the European Union is supposed to be doing, whether it's supposed to be widening and expanding its domain or deepening, which is to say gathering extra competencies and taking over more responsibilities from the nation states that compose the European Union. How much power should the European Union have over the nation states that are its members? In the original formulation, it wasn't very much power at all. But today, the currency is actually under the authority of the European Union, the actual paper money that many of the nation states of the European Union use, the so-called euro. So that's a form of deepening. That's a result of a certain deepening of the competencies of the European Union. We'll talk about competencies, which is kind of a code language for power. Capacities, competencies are these sort of areas or domains in which the European Union can sort of take over the governance of the citizens of the European Union, taking over that power from the nation states. And as a result of that expansion of power, and because citizens are aware that while they can elect representatives to their government at the national level, the European Union doesn't really have a government that can be elected per se. There is a parliament, but it has nothing like the powers that a parliament at the national level has. I'll mention this several times in the lecture as we continue today, that there's been a common perception since day one that the European Union is run by sort of an occult group of elites, technocrats who are, unelected, largely anonymous, powers unto themselves, and just as people like Thomas Jefferson in the history of the United States would have expressed concerns about, any power that is not held in check is a power that falls into corruption, right? It's the lack of accountability. It's sort of a thing. It's to do with human nature. People will sort of start to abuse their power if there's no one looking over their shoulder. And so public disenchantment, and we have a book coming up this semester by Peter Mayer, and I think it's going to really sort of talk about this stuff. It's just one of these very famous books that's going around at the moment. Mayer was an Irish author, an Irish political scientist, and I really wanted to read that book with you guys this semester because it really taps into this question of the sources of public disenchantment and what democracy can mean today in a context where, and this is not just happening, of course, in Europe, it's happening all over, where people are feeling concerned that anonymous bureaucrats are kind of making more and more decisions about how our increasingly technical lives are going to be lived, and we don't really have democratic input into that. At least that's the fear. So, okay, this is, I think, the end of part one now, and we'll take it up with the rest of the slides when I come back.